Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global affairs through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Beitel. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. The UN General Assembly starts next week. This used to be the most exciting event in the UN calendar, but times have changed a lot. We now have Trump 2, we have even less money for the UN, and we have major cuts to aid, foreign aid for poor people that really, really need it. To understand this really much better and to get a better idea of what the UN is and what's happening there, we're absolutely delighted to have with us Susan Brown, United Nations Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations Development Programme. Hi, Susan. It's absolutely lovely to see you.
G'day. Nice to see you too, Alana. Thanks for inviting me to your show.
Well, we've been wanting to do this for some time, as you know, but the real thing is that, first of all, many congratulations. I know you've been in the job for a year, but it's still wonderful. First of all, why don't you give us your full title and then tell us about your lovely career?
My full title, how long have you got? I mean, is this a long form podcast? So I actually have 3 titles, which is a source of amusement to me, but also, considerable pride. So I am a UN Assistant Secretary General, and I work for the United Nations Development Programme. So we are the big operational part of development in the world. So we have about a $5 billion program a year, and we work alongside other development partners like UNICEF, like UN Women, and so on. So we're headed up by an administrator, and I'm an assistant administrator. So I sort of sit at that next level down along with my brothers and sisters that look after regions or policy and program. And then I'm also the director of the Bureau of External Affairs and Advocacy. But you can call me Grand High Poobah if you like.
Well, Lord High Executioner, maybe?
My preferred title is Susan, so just call me Susan.
Exactly. I think we'll stick to Susan because that behoves you. Susan, tell us a bit about your career, because that's how we always start out this podcast, as you may know.
Yes, I have heard that. So my career is completely accidental. It's never been planned. It's basically been a passion journey all the way along. I grew up in the north of Australia on the beaches in North Queensland opposite the Great Barrier Reef. I grew up in a small farming and mining community on the shore of the reef. When I was 13, I moved to the Big Smoke, which was the regional centre for that area. And really, it wasn't a thing then for girls to talk about a career. Like you finish school, usually at the age of 15, but some of us went on to graduate at 17, and you got a job. So it was about getting a job. And after getting a job for 5 years around Australia, I realised that if I didn't go to university, that I would end up kind of in pretty boring jobs, usually at the whim of male bosses, and that was enough of a factor to push me to go. And at the same time, I was getting very interested in looking at the environment and social consequences of development and that dynamic tension, although I didn't have the words for it at that time. So I did a degree in Melbourne. I then went back up to the place I came from. I worked for the Conservation Council there and became an activist by accident. I started to point out the issues with things like sewage going into the Great Barrier Reef, or unfettered development, or massive clearing of riparian areas where you've got pollution going down. After doing that for a year or two and accidentally getting on a bit of a national profile doing it, I was offered a job in Parliament. So again, being completely clueless, I went to federal parliament, and I was in I had 2 very lucky things happened. One is that I worked for the Democrats, who had balance of power at the time. So when the 2 major parties separated, we got to negotiate. So I got a crash course in negotiating. And secondly, I ended up working for 2 fantastic women leaders. And so that really, for the first time gave me a way of looking at and dealing with being in positions of strength, but from a very different perspective, looking at it from a policy perspective, understanding process, parliamentary process, and so on. I did that for 5 years. I then became a journalist for 5 years, which was, another view of looking at all of these issues of governance and environmental sustainability. And then I was headhunted by WWF International. So I moved to Geneva.
Well, that's just
Yes, sorry. The Worldwide Fund for Nature. And I moved to Geneva with my family, husband and 2 small children, for a 1-year contract. Stayed for 11 years, became their UN focal point, headed up their regional and global policy. I was then headhunted by Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. I worked in public health, same sort of thing, advocacy, legislation, process, but at the global level for public health. Then a stint on women's equity and public health and business and sustainability, and then ended up getting a phone call one day, which was a bit of a surprise. On the way, I had become Swiss and being appointed to this job in the UN. So it's been a learning curve and a marvelous journey and never boring.
it sounds absolutely wonderful. And especially we have quite a lot of younger women who listen to this program. And I think it's always inspirational it's inspirational for men too, if they would only admit it. But just to hear how wonderful careers are carved, and usually using John Lennon's wonderful saying, life is what happens to you whilst you're busy making other plans.
That's a term that I use a lot. And I also say, if you're passionate about something and you throw everything into it, you generally end up becoming noticed in your field and being clever and cunning and trying to work out ways to get successes for your issues. So I often say, it's about the issues. It's not about you, it's about what can you do to help facilitate getting a better world. And if, in my experience, and those who I've seen really successful at it, that's where the focus is.
I think that's very, very true. Without passion in anything, but I think especially in what you do with your life, you really do have to have that. And I think it always works much better that way. Well, there we are, 2 old bats talking about passion and careers, but I think it really helps to know that. Coming back to something less exciting, the United Nations.
Well, I'm exciting every day.
The United Nations, which I used to work for and which I have a huge passion for, is not at its best currently, as we all of us know. Budgets are being cut in every way. And especially, as we know, especially since the second Trump administration started, the interest in foreign aid and in helping people has diminished to a very low level. Are you feeling that at the UNDP?
Look, what we're feeling is, I'm told by old timers here that it's the worst of times for the UN at the moment, just in terms of the acceptance of the moral leadership and the ability to facilitate solutions to some of the enduring problems that we're all facing and the multiple problems. So at the moment, we're at an intersection of crises. There's an economic crisis, a climate crisis, multiple conflict crisis, environmental crises. We still have a lot of poverty to deal with. We hover on pandemics. So there are multiple forces that are getting worse and interacting with each other. So this is the time when we absolutely need that leadership and that facilitation and problem solving that the UN can provide. I mean, I feel sad sometimes when I see the blame foisted on the UN because the second Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld, said, and I rely on this all the time, the UN wasn't created to take mankind to heaven. It was created to save us from hell. Now, that's to save humanity from hell. And that's so true. That time that it came in after the Second World War, bringing nations together, the work on decolonization that had been happening since the 1920s and through and after that time, the fright that everyone got at the time when nations were doing what they were doing to each other. I think there was a huge amount of legitimacy for working through ways for peace and security. That's a big part of the UN, for the humanitarian responses that are needed. And then eventually the UN turned into the development side. So how do you actually develop in a way which is better, which is fairer, which is more cognizant of environmental sustainability, and developing in such a way that it fosters those outcomes or helps strengthen the potential for stability and for peace. Moment where I thought we had got to in 2015 when the Sustainable Development Goals agreement came through, because that was the first time you had this huge agenda where there was an understanding of the interactions of all of these forces and where all governments signed on. And they signed on for 15 years with a very ambitious view of the world. And, then here we are moving along to it. We get a recession, we get a pandemic, we get, and now we're at this piece where there's multipolarity coming up. There's conflict that's happening. We're hovering on recessions, very slow economic growth. Most of the world is looking at less than 1%. So it's a terrible set of circumstances. And then going back to your point about overseas development aid, a bunch of governments who were supporting it, and not just the US, have re-looked at their budgets and said this isn't where we want to prioritize expenditure. And so they're pulling funding out. One of the areas, so there are immediate consequences which will happen in the humanitarian space, in the UN space with the liquidity crisis, in the ability that we have to work on these various aspirations for sustainable development. But I think there's a clear and present danger that hasn't been realized yet, which is if you look at the EU and Global Gateway, if you look at the US, and if you look at other political messages that we're getting, which are saying we're going to be much more transactional. We really want to get into enabling economies. We want to move the private sector forward. It's much more about the business diplomacy messaging. The UN de-risks that space. And I don't think that the consequences of us having reduced effort in the de-risking space have been looked at or understood. Because if we're not there, UNDP helps get multilateral development bank loans out the door, for example, because we work with governments on their governance, the judicial piece, the rule of law piece, the financial regulatory piece, and so on. If societies are becoming more unstable, if the environment is not protected as much, it's polluted, there's the effects of climate change happening, that's a much more volatile investment space. So I think there's consequences not just ODAs coming from the UN. What does that mean for the humanitarian side? For the development side and for the economic side, there's a whole set of circumstances to unpack there that need to be thought through.
Well, I think we can either stop the podcast now or we can try and unpack everything that you've said. But I do think that you've raised a number of fascinating points, and I mean that quite seriously, which I don't think most people even begin to think about. But let's go right back to the very beginning. And let me ask you a question which most people don't dare ask in many cases, which is, what is development and why should we care about it?
What is development? Humans like to grow. Societies like to grow. And as societies develop, as you come together, as you think about your primary resource needs, your shelter needs, your prosperity, your ambition for humans, the way that we work together, the way that governments look after their societies, because that's what we charge them with. That's sort of a bit of a Rousseau type thing, but coming from Switzerland, I have to inject a bit of the Genevois. But, we ask governments to look after us, or we require them to, we trust them to. And so governments do need to think through what they are governing, their societies, their environment, their relationships with the rest of the world. As I said earlier, the initial part of the UN was around the peace and security and the humanitarian piece. But after some time, it was realized that societies were developing, they were progressing, and that progression had to be across a whole lot of factors, whether it was infrastructure development, whether it was about justice or democracy building or equity or how we interact with the environment, how we use resources. And we have all of these relationships that cross borders. And so UNDP was born 60 years ago this year. And its initial birth came from Article 55, I guess, of the UN Charter, which is about development. And so it is about economic and social prosperity. And so what we do and what we have grown to do over the years is work with governments on that. And we're charged to work across a whole lot of areas. So if I can turn that into something a little bit more concrete. Singapore credit UNDP with working with them to move from where they were into the place they are now. I heard the Chinese ambassador say in June this year in front of a number of member states that we had helped China move hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So we work hand in hand with governments on their requirements and their ambition for progress, and whether it's bringing broccoli to China or building the first freeways in Saudi Arabia or helping 700 million people get access to voting in the last few years, or working with a bunch of governments, most governments, on their nationally determined contributions for climate change. So we're a support mechanism across a range of areas.
So, yeah, I think it's important. So basically, you don't deal in crises. That's the humanitarian side of the house. You do. So how would you differentiate for the non-initiated between development and humanitarian aid?
Yes, so the humanitarian aid comes in for that immediate crisis response. But I'll give you an example. What we do with crisis is we work on stabilization and early recovery towards a development pathway rather than staying in a constant long-term humanitarian crisis. So if I can give an example, yesterday we had a crisis bureau meeting on Afghanistan, where there was an earthquake recently. And right on the other side of the mountains, Pakistan, where there are big floods in the Indus Valley and where we have a huge response. So our part is housing. They're coming into winter, temporary housing, and then getting housing pathways. Infrastructure, what's happened to the roads? We come in and we work on the roads piece. Cash and the movement of funds so that economies can, small local economies can keep going. In Ukraine, we're doing demining. We're working on mental health issues for returned people from the front line and what that can do in terms of communities. There's a whole menu of different things that we work on. In Gaza, it's infrastructure work as well. And I mean, even rubble removal, massive program on rubble removal. So we do have a role in the crisis space. We work hand in hand with the World Food Programme or with the other big parts of the crisis response in the UN system. But our role is on that stabilization and recovery piece.
Right. So how would you again put that just alongside these OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Aid, which sits in the United Nations? Again, the external observer would say, aren't you just doubling things up?
Well, I don't know. Are they building the roads back?
I don't know. You tell me. No, again, for the uninitiated, it's very difficult to understand. I said to you, you don't do crisis. You said, yes, we do crisis. But if you do crisis, then what does the humanitarian aid people do?
Well, that's what I was just differentiating. So we all have different roles in the UN system, and we work together on those roles. And there's a whole piece called it's the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, and different bits of the UN do different jobs in that. And we work very closely with OCHA and Tom and his team there, or with World Food Programme, or with UNICEF, or with others that come in. We each have our defined bits of the response.
It's good. That's very good. I would just go back and say one thing, because I find that it's just not spoken about enough, but that in Afghanistan, a lot of women were not removed from the disaster zone because all of the rescue teams were male and they wouldn't touch a woman that isn't a member of their family. So I know you can't comment on it, but I can. So I think it's just so appalling, and it's Yeah, 4 years, isn't it, since the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the situation of women there just gets worse and worse and worse.
We are still there. We are still working. We work with a lot of communities, and that is definitely an issue that we and other UN organisations and civil society face, is that issue around the rights of women there. It's something that's very active in terms of work and conversation, and where we all wish we were getting a lot further, a lot faster.
Yeah, I think many of us do. But anyway, I had to get that one in there because I think it's just not spoken about enough. It's just really not spoken about enough. But anyway, coming back to the UNDP, what used to be its budget and what is its budget now?
Well, so our budget is about $5 billion a year, US dollars. And it's important to know where that's from so that you understand the impact. So about $1.5 billion of that comes from program countries, from developing countries investing in their own development. And that's also a little known thing.
Absolutely.
Yes. So we work in 170 countries. We're sort of present in 136. We actually have a program with every country, a country program document. We sign off on that with the government, and it basically says this is what we need you to do from all of the things that you do, and we do a huge number of different things. It's very contextual, and we sign off on that, and it's enforced for a few years, and we work together on that. So countries themselves put in for their own development, and that's about a quarter of our budget. We then get a lot of funding, which is earmarked funding towards very particular things. So on climate change, for example, we're working with the majority of governments on their nationally determined contributions, which is the outcome of the Paris Agreement, which is basically about reducing emissions. And so that can be at the policy level, or it can be at the decommissioning fossil fuel type, and bringing in options and getting the pathway right for investment in renewable or softer energy parts. You get hundreds of millions of dollars a year for HIV/AIDS implementation, because the Global Fund is the center of this, the Global Fund for HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. So they're the global center, but they're not present in the country. We are. So we do a lot of the implementation work with them. There will be funding for work on women's equality. So that's channeled into us, but very earmarked. We're going to give you this funding, but it specifically has to be for this. And that's the largest part of our funding. Philanthropists put in some funding as well. Again, pretty earmarked towards specific things that they want to work on. And then there's a small amount of our funding, which is in the last few years has been about 560 to 580 million a year. And that's what's called core funding. It's unearmarked. That's gold for us, because that gives us the flexibility to be able to work on the issues that are needed more in the global space. It's what pays for the UNDP presence and senior staff and our headquarters, our sort of central node. But about 60% of that goes into the crisis and fragile states work, which we do in all of the 70 crisis and fragile states.
So where does that funding come from? That comes from the UN or from where?
We get no money that's assessed. So all of the $5 billion that comes into us is voluntary contributions. So that's people coming to us saying, we're going to pay you to do X, Y, Z because we think that, you're the ones that we need to do this. So of the $5 billion that comes in, we get about between 91 and 92 cents out the door in program implementation. So we're actually, in the scheme of things, pretty cheap. 8 cents in the dollar gets you the huge presence and the scale, the impact. Now, what has been the change? The primary change is to the core funding. So that is that 580 million. That's where donors have, some, not all, where some have reduced that. And they've reduced it for a few reasons. Not because they don't believe in us, because they go to the UN, they say that all the time. I watched a bunch of them say it last week 2 weeks ago at our executive board, but because of forces coming in on them at the national level. So that could be in Europe, a large amount of funding going to Ukraine or to the NATO spending, which, you have way more expertise in than I do. So that's one big thing which has hit the European donors. The economic times, hovering a bit or, just a bit above recession with slower economic growth, post-COVID loans coming due, and also the accountability to their own populations who are becoming more conservative, or more conservative politicians coming in saying, we believe the budget should be spent at home. We've got issues there, youth unemployment, lack of housing, pension funds, whatever. There's a whole basket of issues, and much more conservative views that this should be spent at home rather than in some distal way on overseas aid. And in the US as well, there was that dramatic, initially it was called a pause, but then a cut in funding for this year. We're still waiting to see how the US will think about these things in the next few years. They are doing a review of the UN. Now, last time President Trump was in, we had a great relationship. They understood what we do. They really relied on this. We didn't suffer a funding cut at all. This time, we're waiting for the UN review that they're doing and where they decide priorities. But having said that, we're used to governments changing priorities. And so we're used to funding going up and down from various donors. There are other governments who have cut, or they haven't cut this year, but they've said next year there'll be a cut too. A bunch of Europeans as well are in that situation. We're not as badly hit as a number of our sister agencies. For us, we're looking at probably something like from 560 million down to, at the lower end, maybe around the 400 million part. Out of 5 billion, that doesn't seem like a lot, but from our core funding, it's actually, it's going to mean changes. One of the unpalatable things that I and all of my colleagues need to do is reduce our budget expenditure, and that will mean some significant changes.
Does that mean that you may even be out of a job? I hope not, Susan.
I am here at the pleasure of the Secretary General. He appointed me, and at the pleasure of the administrator of the organisation. So, if they came to me tomorrow and said, look, sorry, it's not going to work, well, that's their choice to make. The way I see it, I'm just here. I've literally got my sleeves rolled up, and I'll just work my butt off until that day comes.
I think that's an excellent thing to hear. How much longer, just as a matter of interest, is both the administrator, the Secretary General, this is his last year, I think.
I think they're launching the process now for the new Secretary General, and that's a member state decision. I mean, that's one of the other things. You got to, when you work in an organisation, you got to swallow some stuff, right? And one of the things that's a bit difficult is we're the public servants, and it's the member states who are making the decisions on a whole lot of things at the moment, and we implement. I mean, obviously we stand up for the values and the norms of the UN. We believe in that, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And so we're waiting for, to see the outcome of the current geopolitics. But in part of that will be negotiations over the new Secretary General that will happen over the next year. Obviously, that takes you then straight into the Security Council, because at the end of the day, it's those 5 members of the Security Council that need to come up with an agreement. So we wait and see.
Indeed. Well, they'll devote another episode to that at another time. But it's just worthwhile noting that, first of all, the Secretary General of the United Nations is selected by rotation of continent, and the next rotation is South America. And hopefully, I would remind you that in the previous rotation, which is the European rotation, there were initially only 2 criteria for selecting the new Secretary General, which was that it should be a woman from Eastern Europe.
Yes.
And surprise, surprise, we ended up with another old man from Western Europe. But I'm not quite sure what the criteria are for this upcoming Secretary General, but it will be interesting to see. But I very much think that it'll be difficult, because since the Security Council is deadlocked on every issue, I doubt very much that it's going to be a very easy selection. But we shall have to wait and see. Coming back, though, to
2 points for you there. One is they did release the start of the Secretary General's process, I think, last week. And as to the regional bit and the, you know, whether it's a woman or not, personally, I very much hope for a woman because it's time. That one's above my pay grade. That's firmly in the bailiwick of the member states. But it has started. I think it was officially launched last week, and it'll or if it wasn't, it's very close. And then the other thing on the Security Council deadlocked, yes, a lot of the time. But last Thursday there was a unanimous decision of the Security Council, and that was on the bombing in Qatar. So they can get there.
yes, that is true, but you have to agree that it's an exceedingly rare occasion in which they do get there. But there's no doubt about that one, that it's easier when it's something that everybody can condemn together. I don't think they've actually agreed on anything positive for a long time together. But hey ho. I think you also raise another hugely important point, which is often deeply misunderstood by people outside of the multilateral world, which is the vast majority of humanity. And that is that whilst you have the Secretary General and you have, you know, the Secretariat of the UN and you have the administration of the UNDP and it is the member states who wield the power in all these organizations. And they love to, you know, sort of lay it on the organizations. But at the end of the day, the Secretary General of the United Nations is not the CEO of the United Nations. He works at the pleasure of the states and not the other way around, really. And people tend to not understand that. And it's really terribly easy for the national politicians to, the same happens with the EU, to just, you know, dump the blame for a bad decision on the organization. But actually, the organization is usually doing whatever it is that the member states want them to do, because they're the ones who have decided that is what is happening. So it does make working for such an organization exhilarating on the one hand, because you get to do lots of fascinating things, but maybe you feel it's different. But I know that I had my moments of deep frustration, and I know many people do.
Yeah, you know, I think for me, I get up every day with hope. Whether that's misfounded or not, but I still feel like, you know, I get to travel a lot. I always have done before this job and in this job, and also lots of human interaction. And I still have an absolute belief in humanity, in us coming together, in somehow us finding that compassion exists, whether it's at the individual and the family level, the community level, and we're all in different communities these days, the way we organize ourselves. So I still have a belief we'll get there. Maybe that's super naive. But there are good things that happen, and they're a bit under the radar because they're not interesting for the news and they're not clickbait. But, you know, wouldn't it be great if there was, you know, one of those little clickbait things, you know, look inside and you'll find the answer. But 2 weeks ago, all the member states of our executive board unanimously agreed our strategic plan for the next 4 years. And that's no small thing. That's $20 billion worth of development for the good of the environment and humanity and governance. And they agreed that, you know, it's on 7 topic areas. You will work with the governments in the world on governance, on their governance systems, their sectoral relationships, their policy architecture, their programmatic piece. And we will work on sustainable finance issues with those governments. We will work on gender equity with governments and communities. We will work on prosperity. We don't call it poverty anymore, but we call it prosperity for all. You will work on environment, AI, and digital transformation, and on the crisis piece we talked about earlier. So all of those member states in a
Who are the states?
So we're governed, our body comes under, so everyone's heard about the Security Council, but there's another council as well, which is the Economic and Social Council. And that sits under the UN General Assembly. All of the for members are members of that. And then a section of the economic representative, regionally representative group of the Economic and Social Council form our executive board. But, they all come in there when it happens, and they all get a chance to speak, and then you get 36 voting members. But all of them said, we want you to work on this for the next 4 years, completely unanimous. Not a news story, but a really powerful expression of still hope, aspiration, determination to get to as far as we can towards the Sustainable Development Goals.
What is your pitch, really? I mean, come to a corporate organization or come to an supposedly rich state that is cutting its budget because it's more isolationist. What's your pitch to them? Why should they give you money?
Well, a lot of them have been, and they know that. And often you find with development staff, so with heads of development corporation, which sit in the 15 major donor countries, which are basically the high-income countries. So they actually understand that problems cross borders, pandemics cross borders, climate change crosses borders, financial relationships and dependencies cross borders, people cross borders, knowledge. And so trade, we need to know those and find those ways to get along together, deal with the friction points and so on. So often it's actually already accepted, and it's more an expression of sorrow that I get, like, really sorry, we're going to cut you because of X, Y, Z. Or on the other hand, there's a bunch of governments who've come to us and said, we're not going to let this destroy what we believe in, backtrack what we believe in. And so we're either going to give you a bit more, some governments have done that, or we're going to make it a multi-year agreement now. So so that you've got that certainty. So we had some, but we've got quite a few more. We're going to speak out really strongly now about the value of the United Nations and the value of the work we do. So it has actually had a bit of a positive impact in that sense, that some countries who were kind of coasting and taking it for granted, and here we were in a groove, have said, actually, we need to stand up and defend this, and we're going to do that, and have been super vocal about it.
Good to know. What about corporates? Are they interested?
Yeah, now that's an interesting point. I'm going to go and speak with a bunch of bankers in a couple of weeks, and I actually want to raise this issue of the risk level increasing in the financial space. So I think corporates are very versed in corporate social responsibility. Now, you can say that can be because some of them have been burned, or because some of them have, really realized they've walked their Damascene path, and they've realized, actually, we do need to have a relationship. We need our local legitimacy. We need our public and community legitimacy, and it's the right thing to do. So I think they get the corporate social responsibility piece, and I think they get the environmental piece much more. I'm not sure. And I think that, the insurance agencies, they realize the cost of climate change, because their actuaries are factoring it in now to the premiums. But I do think there's a bigger conversation on the risk thing to be had. You touch upon another point, which is who should fund these externalities. And the private sector have been getting, they would say, oh, well, we pay our tax. Some people would say there's a bit of free riding that's been happening here on a whole lot of these externalities, and more there's this recognition and these conversations that need to happen. Governments, so, we've got the 15 kind of major donors, but more donors are coming in. So you do now have Gulf states thinking about what's their relationship in the global space and what's their contribution in the global space. And so I think there is a bit of reformulation with this multipolarity that's happening in the political space, where it is understood that you can have your trade relationships, you can have your political relationships. It is also important to have the development relationships as well because of these things that are crossing. There are fascinating political dynamics. More and more we hear from the African continent. This is a time now, this is an opportunity. And my African colleague, she says this is a polytunity time. This isn't a polycrisis, this is a polytunity. This is a time for entrepreneurship, a time for us to start forging our own path and sort of push away from the pressures of dealing with debt or, dealing with some people making most of the decisions for the rest of us. So for a student of politics, it's a fascinating time.
It's a totally fascinating time. And this conversation is totally fascinating, though we're going to have to really come towards its end. But in the multipolarity, where does China stand on development and the UNDP?
China is very supportive of UNDP. We have a huge program there. In the last board, we put through our next multi-year program document with China, which it funds itself, and it's a fan of UNDP. So we work very well with China in China, as we do with 170 countries where we have really active work.
So listening to you, Susan, there was this big piece that came out in Foreign Policy magazine written by Adam Tooze that, development is at an end, development is over. You don't think so by the sounds of it.
Well, I still come to work every day and there's a whole heap of people buzzing around here and 23,000 staff around the world working on it. So nobody's told them that yet. And governments are still wanting their work signed off. They're still coming to us asking for, our support and help with where they want to go. I'm not sure how many people have read the piece yet.
Few, but I suspect that we just need to get them to listen to you, and that's a good comeback on it. So that will be really, really good. Susan Brown, thank you so much for this lovely conversation. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Give us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, enemies, colleagues, family, and anyone you think who would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast and on ELN, Twitter, Facebook. And we now have our own YouTube channel, so you can even see us. All information and links mentioned in the episode can be found in the notes. I'm Ilana Beit-El, together with my friend and producer Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.